Let's roll. Good evening, everyone. We are very pleased to have tonight as our speaker, Jan Bietenbeck from Economics Department, Lund University. Jan does labor, education, health, and more general human capital. In addition to being a faculty of Lund University, he is also a research fellow at German Institute of Economic Research, DIW, and ESA Institute in Bonn. His masters are from the University of Edinburgh, I'm sorry, that's Edinburgh, right? And then Center for Monetary and Financial Studies, CInSt in Madrid, where he also got his PhD. Now, Jan is going to talk on own motivation, peer motivation, and educational success. Jan, thanks very much. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. I will start sharing my screen. Okay. This, I guess you can see this now.
Yeah, everything is perfect, please.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, thanks again. I'm very excited to present my research here to you, and I'm looking very much forward to your comments, especially because this is a single authored project, which I wrote essentially last year when the university was at least partly locked down, and I haven't had so much opportunity to get feedback yet. As Leonid said, I'm going to talk for around 45 minutes. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat. Especially if something is unclear, please don't hesitate to interrupt me or to post the question in the chat, and then we have some time for discussion afterwards.
Yes.
All right, so this paper, the starting point of this paper is this very large literature in psychology and a growing literature in economics that shows that at the individual level, personality matters a great deal for educational and labor market success. And this literature has studied aspects of personality such as grit, such as patience, big five factors, and it has shown that these factors are closely associated with outcomes such as test scores in schools, high school graduation, college enrollment, and wages in the labor market. Moreover, recent related work also shows that large-scale school-based programs can actually boost such beneficial aspects of personality, such as grit or patience in children, and thereby improve their school performance. So at the individual level, we are starting to have a really good idea of what really matters in terms of psychology and how we can actually foster it in schools. And this is very different when we talk about effects of personality not on our own outcomes, but on the outcomes of others in our social environment, that is our peers. That we know so little about peer effects and personality is somewhat surprising, I think, because in economics, we have this large literature that tells us that peers matter for outcomes both in the education sector, but also in the labor market. And especially we know from many studies that school peers' cognitive ability and their socio-demographic composition causally affect education outcomes. Now, what I argue in this paper is that we should look beyond just cognitive ability and this socio-demographic composition, and also study whether peers' personality affect others' outcomes in the school environment. One reason why this is important is that if personality does indeed create these kind of spillover effects, the benefits of school-based programs could be severely miscalculated. So what we've seen in the literature is like a series of evaluations of these targeted large-scale programs where, for example, primary school children are giving some training to increase their grit or their patience, and then we know that this affects their grades in school as well and their learning. Now, if there's also a spillover effect, and me being more gritty also makes my neighbors, for example, my siblings, my peers, and all kinds of other available, all kinds of other environments more perform better, then these benefits are much larger than we previously thought, right? And this will bias our cost-benefit analysis if we don't take this into account. So what I do in this paper then is to provide some first evidence of such spillover effects. And I focus on a particular aspect of personality, namely academic motivation, and I study how it shapes children's own and their peers' educational success, both in the short run and in the long run. Now, this focus on motivation is in line with research in psychology, which essentially tells us that the core of personality is made up by 4 domains. One domain is traits, which is what many people know as the big 5 personality traits. This is a typical measure. And another separate domain is motives, which is where this academic motivation comes in. And then there are two other domains that I'm not going to talk about today. So what I'm measuring here is essentially this academic motivation, which is part of a core domain of personality. To study how motivation matters for educational success, I use secondary data from Project STAR. This was a randomized controlled trial in the United States, which originally was designed to measure the effects of class size on student achievement. Here, I'm going to abstract almost fully from the class size debate and I just exploit two key advantages of this study design. The first is that this was a longitudinal study which measured elementary schools students' academic motivation using a standardized psychological test using a validated scale. And this was done when the children were around 6 to 8 years old. And with the data, I can then relate this measure of motivation to their school outcomes all the way until the end of high school, so up to 12 years later, age 18. Yeah? And this allows me to study how own motivation shapes own educational success. Now, the really new part here is that I can also use the second key feature of this experiment, which is that students in the experiment were randomly assigned to classes, which generated exogenous variation in peers' motivation. By using this fact, this exogenous variation in peers' motivation, I can estimate causal spillover effects. I will tell you much more about how I do this in detail in a few minutes, but just to give you a quick preview of my two main results. At the individual level, I find that academic motivation in early elementary school predicts own long-term educational success, as measured, for example, by standardized test scores in reading and math, high school graduation, the taking of college entrance exams, and so on and so forth. Right? So it's really highly predictive of this. Of course, with these kind of relations or associations, a big question is always, is this really motivation driving this, or is this something else? Is it some correlated unobserved factor that I cannot control for? I would say here in this context, the sort of like most obvious potential confounder is cognitive ability. While I don't have a perfect measure of cognitive ability, I can at least control for achievement in kindergarten, here abbreviated as KG. So achievement before motivation was measured, and my results fully hold, actually coefficients don't change. So this gives me at least some suggestive idea that what's going on here is really driven by motivation rather than just cognitive ability. Then the second key result, and perhaps the most exciting result in this paper, is that students who are randomly assigned to classes with more motivated peers show higher achievement on standardized tests. So this is the evidence of a personality spillover effect. Now, again, the question is, these motivated peers, is it their drive or their causing a higher test score result? Is it because they're more motivated, or is it because motivated peers are also higher performing? And again, like all the peer effects literature, I cannot fully exclude all possibilities, but what I can do is to control for peers' past achievement, again, an imperfect proxy, but a proxy for cognitive ability, and for the socio-demographic composition, and for example, in terms of their gender, their race, their age, etc., etc. And as you will see, the results hold when I include all of these controls, which really suggests what I'm picking up here is a personality spillover from peers' motivation that's not due to something else. I also look at whether peer motivation affects own motivation, and I find no evidence of that. And then I also find no evidence that if you're in school or if you're in class with more motivated peers in primary school, that in the long term you have any benefits. And of course, this kind of null result or zero result raises some question about the potential mechanism, and I will talk about that later on. Just a few words on the related literature and contribution. I contribute mainly to two literatures. The first literature is this psychology and economics literature on personality and own educational success. Here, a lot of different factors have been studied. There's a series of papers by Angela Duckworth and co-authors on grid. We've had a lot of papers on Big Five. Patience has also been studied, and many other factors. There's also existing evidence on motivation in psychology, but that existing evidence has used mostly small samples of maybe a couple of hundred students and short follow-ups of 1 or 2 years. So the contribution here is to provide new evidence using a really long follow-up up to 12 years and a sample that at least in psychology is considered very large, with more than 9,000 students that were part of this randomized experiment. And then the second literature that I contribute to is the literature on peer effects, which is a large literature in economics of education. However, this literature has so far focused on things that are perhaps more easily measurable, including peers' academic ability as proxied by their test scores, and peers' demographic background, for example, the share of females in your classroom. The only published paper that I'm aware of on personality peer effects, so that explicitly looks at what is the personality of peers, like what kind of difference does that make, is this paper by Goldstein and co-authors that's forthcoming in the Journal of Political Economy. And what they show is that in a college setting, if you're randomly assigned to a small class with more persistent peers, where persistence is measured using a psychological questionnaire, you do better. And they also find that this persistent peer effect operates over and above kind of ability peer effects. So they control for peers' cognitive ability as measured by their past test scores and their socio-demographic composition. So similarly to what I would. My contribution here is then to provide the second paper overall, and actually the first paper in the school setting on personality peer effects. And I think this is particularly relevant because, as I said before, what we're seeing now is a lot of interventions happening at the primary school level, which try to teach kids these kind of non-cognitive skills. And we need to know what are the benefits. Are there benefits beyond the kids themselves also for their peers? Now, in terms of the rest of the talk, I want to give you some more details about the data I used from Project STAR, and in particular this motivation measure. And then I will just go one by one through the results, first for own motivation and then for peer motivation. And finally, I'll conclude. So as I already said, I use data from Project STAR, which actually stands for Student-Teacher Achievement Ratio. And this was a study of class size effects on student achievement that ran in the 1980s in Tennessee in the United States. The study here followed a single cohort of more than 11,000 children from the beginning of kindergarten, where children enter when they're roughly 5 years old, up until the end of third grade, so when they're 9 or 10 years old. And 79 schools participated in this experiment. The schools, as we will see later, were disproportionately chosen from low-income neighborhoods. So what we're talking about is a essentially low-income neighborhood sample in Tennessee in the 1980s. Now, what's important, or what's going to be important later on, is that not all students were part of this study from the beginning of kindergarten until third grade. Only around half the students joined at the beginning of kindergarten, and then a lot of other students, the other half, joined later, so in first grade, second grade, or third grade. And there were two main reasons for this. The first is that kindergarten at that time was not part of the official school curriculum. It was not mandatory. So many kids just started school in first grade and skipped kindergarten. And the second is that there was, in these low-income neighborhoods, there was a lot of residential mobility. What would happen is that a family would move into a school catchment area of a participating school. If they had a kid of the right age, that kid would then start school after they moved, say in grade 2, and become part of this randomized experiment of the study cohort. Now, the key feature of the experiment here is that students and teachers were randomized into classes within schools. And in particular, students were randomized at the school by entry grade level. So what that means is essentially whenever you first entered a school participating in the experiment, that's the time when you were randomly assigned to a class. So for those who started kindergarten already in the experimental schools, it was the beginning of kindergarten. For other students who started later on, whose parents moved into the catchment area, say between first and second grade, they would be randomly assigned to one of the existing classes at the beginning of second grade. And the same for third grade, same for first grade. Classes here differed in size. There were small classes with around 15 students, or large classes with around 22 students. And that's just because the purpose of the original experiment was to measure class size effects. I can already tell you now that I'm always going to control for these different treatment arms, but I can actually also do away completely with this small class treatment and only look at normal regular sized classes, and all my results follow through this. Finally, the experiment ended after the end of third grade, but the experiment was deemed very important. And that's why researchers kept coming back and collecting data for participants in this study and surveying them, collecting administrative data, etc. And with the data available to me now, I can observe outcomes all the way up until age 18, when most students enter college or finish high school and enter college. Now, this study is particularly useful for the question of interest, how personality affects peers, because it has this nice psychological assessment of students' academic motivation. And this assessment happened at the end of grades 1, 2, and 3 in the spring, so end of the academic year. And in all of these grades, students' academic motivation was assessed using the so-called SCAMIN test, which is short for the Self-Concept and Motivation Inventory. And that's a group-administered psychological test developed in the 1960s by Milkes and co-authors. So it's quite an old test. Also because this study is, of course, only done in the 1980s, so quite old. And it has two separate parts on academic self-concept. I'm going to mostly ignore that today. And then the second part, academic motivation. And that's sort of like the one which aims at measuring motivation, which is one of the core domains of personality as in these prototypical psychological models. Now, the key features of the motivation assessment was as follows. As I said, this was group administered, and in particular in Project START was administered by the class teacher who went up in front of the class and asked students 12 questions. All questions began with the word, what face would you wear? For an example, he would ask, or she would ask, what face would you wear if you could read like a grown-up? In response to this question, students then had to paint or fill in 1 out of 5 faces that they had been given on a prepared answer sheet. And these faces ranged from very sad to very happy. So intuitively, if you're very happy, if you think about yourself reading like a grown-up, you're very motivated to learn reading like a grown-up, right? If you're 6 or 7 years old. And the questions were not only about reading, they were also about math, about achieving in schools, et cetera, in general. So the question is, is this a good measure of motivation? There have been some validation studies. What's important, for example, is that this is the score, or let me first say, what happens is like, okay, the kids answer these 12 questions and the researchers calculate a motivation score from each student's answers. And this is what I observe in the data. Now it turns out this motivation score is related or correlated with motivation scores from other, also well-established assessments of motivation. And this kind of way of measuring motivation in children using facial expressions and like asking them to paint in faces is very well recognized in psychology, right? Because you don't want kids not to answer because they can't read or write yet. So this is like a good way to measure these things. All right, then in terms of outcome measures, I'm going to focus on 3 sets of outcome measures today, or measures of educational success. The first is just standardized test scores in reading and math. And I observed those in essentially all grades between grade 1 and 8, with the exception of 4th grade. Just to save time and in order not to show too many regression results, I'm usually going to bunch them together into grades 1 to 3, so early elementary school, and middle school grades, so grades 5 to 8. And these are going to be standardized to have mean 0, standard deviation 1, just to make interpretation straightforward. Then we have what I call measures of long-term educational success. I'm going to focus on a dummy which measures high school graduation, which I unfortunately only have for a subset of the students participating in the experiment, and then a second dummy for taking of an ACT or SAT test. There have been other studies that can follow these students until they actually enroll in college, and what they've shown is that this measure, taking an ACT or SAT test in this particular sample, is essentially a measure of enrolling in college. Okay, so this is like almost 1-for-1 here. And then finally, I have a bunch of measures of classroom behavior. These come from teacher ratings in 4th and 8th grade. So in 4th grades, teachers were asked to rate students on 25 questions. These 25 questions, or the answers to those, were combined into 3 scales. Then in 8th grade, again, the class teachers were asked to rate students on 12 questions. It was a reduced form of the same questionnaire. And again, it was combined into these same 3 scales. The 3 scales were effort, initiative, and discipline, where the effort scale measures things such as the student pays attention in class, he or she completes the assigned work, he or she's persistent when faced with difficult problems, versus she gives up easily, etc. So this, and then we have the initiative scale, which is about asking questions in class, doing sort of like more than the work that you have been assigned to do, striking up a conversation with the teacher outside of the classroom, and generally showing initiative. And then the final scale that I'm going to talk about today is the discipline scale, which essentially just measures good behavior in the classroom. So it's about not distracting your peers, not needing to be reprimanded, not running around the classroom, right? So in all these scales, higher scores mean better behavior. And I standardize the scales to have mean 0, standard deviation 1. So let's look at the first results on motivation and own educational success. For this analysis, I just select all students with any information on motivation in at least one of the 3 grades. Again, remember, motivation was measured both in first, second, and third grade. Not all 11,000 students, we don't have measures for all 11,000 students because some data was lost when they transferred it from like handwritten transcripts to the computer, and also some students dropped out of the experiment already before first grade. But overall, these 9,000 students are roughly representative of the sample at large. The main and independent variable, just for convenience, is going to be average motivation across grades 1, 2, and 3. It's just so I don't have to show you regressions for here's first grade motivation and all these outcomes, here's second grade motivation, all these outcomes, and the same for third grade, right? It's really just for convenience. If I take any of these individual grade measures, things look very similar. Also, by doing this, I maximize sample size. Remember that some parents or families move in and out of the districts in which these schools are lying. And then I would have, for example, a measure of motivation in first grade, but not second grade, and so on and so forth. I'm just going to average across everything I have in terms of motivation measure. But again, things follow through if I just concentrate on one particular grade for a subsample. As already indicated, this sample reflects the oversampling of low-income schools in the study. 60% of students here are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, which is an indicator of poverty, and 35% are Black. 82% finished high school, but only 38% took an ACT or SAT test and then enrolled in college. So what I'm going to do here is just estimate associations by ordinary least squares. Outcome Y for student I in school by entry grade cells, a randomization block S, on the average motivation and a bunch of controls, and always I include a randomization block fixed effects, right? This is school by entry grades. Now, this is not going to give us the causal effect, at least not necessary, right? Because there are, as I argued in the introduction, there are potential correlated unobserved factors, in particular cognitive ability, which is likely correlated with both motivation and the outcome. So what I'm going to do here is to control for math and reading achievement in kindergarten, past achievement as a first way to proxy for cognitive ability. So let's look at some results. So the first thing I want to show you is this is not necessarily a measure of education success, it's just behavior in the classroom as measured by teachers. We have these measures for 4th grade and for 8th grade. So around, say, 2 to 3 years after motivation was measured, or then 6 to 7 years later. And what you see here is the predicted change due to a 1 standard deviation higher motivation in early elementary school. The point estimates are the blue diamonds, dark blue diamonds, and then we have the 95% confidence intervals, the light blue bars. What you see, if we first look at the first leftward 3 coefficients, is that a 1 standard deviation higher motivation in elementary school is associated with higher effort, around 10% of a standard deviation, higher initiative, and higher better discipline, so not like distracting your peers. So on all these scales, essentially you're behaving better in the classroom, right? If we look at 8th grade, we also see these positive associations. The coefficients are somewhat lower here, and there are 2 potential reasons for this, which I cannot distinguish. The first is that there might actually be some sort of fade out, right? It might be that motivation in elementary schools, as measured in elementary school, matters less and less the further you go away from it or the further you go along. Or the second reason is that these scales are not directly comparable to 4th grade. Remember that only a subset of questions here, a shorter questionnaire was used compared to fourth grade. So we shouldn't directly compare these coefficients, okay? I mean, the main takeaway for me here is that this motivation test, which I was a little bit skeptical about, you know, I mean, I don't know so much about psychology. I read about it. There were some validation studies, but what's the good news for me here is that this motivation as measured by this test is actually reflected in different behaviors in the classroom, right? We can see that. So let's look at whether this also affects educational success. And here we have the main results for this part. And here we have two different axes. Let's look at the first four estimates, which are plotted on the leftward axis here. This is test scores. Again, we're talking about the predicted change due to 1 standard deviation higher motivation in grades 1 to 3. And we have the point estimates and 95% confidence intervals. And so the estimates here are for reading scores between grade 1 and 3, math scores in the same grades, and then middle school, so grade 5 to 8 reading scores and math scores. And throughout, essentially what we see that if you have a 1 standard deviation higher motivation, you get around 5% of a test score, 5% of standard deviation higher test score on all of these tests, right? No fade out to be seen here. It's pretty much the same across all grades. Now, is this a large coefficient or not? If we compare this, for example, to the coefficient for free lunch, it's around 20 to 25%, right? So being a free lunch student versus a not free lunch student gives you 20% of a standard deviation versus to 25% of a standard deviation disadvantage in all of these measures. Here we see 5%, so it's like between a quarter to a fifth of the free lunch gap. Okay, so not a very large effect, very precisely estimated. Then let's look at these longer term outcomes. So that's the new part here. Here, the latest outcome, the last outcome we can observe is taking an SAT or ACT exam at the age of 18, so up to 12 years after motivation was measured. What we see is that students with a 1 standard deviation higher motivation in early elementary school are 1.5 percentage points more likely to apply for college, right? Now, this again doesn't seem like much, but if you compare this to the baseline was that only 38% in the overall sample do apply to college or do take this ACT, SAT test. It's around like a 4% or so increase over the baseline, right? So it's not nothing. We also see a slight increase in the probability of graduating from high school. There's a star here, and that just is supposed to indicate again that the data we have are much worse here because this was collected only for a subset of students, right? Which is why we also see these very large confidence bounds. So a question that I brought up before a couple of times is like, is this really an effect of motivation, or is this, like some correlated unobserved characteristics? We can quickly look at the regression table to get a sort of answer for this. Now, the gray estimates here, these are exactly the same point estimates as we saw in the graph, are the ones where I don't control for cognitive ability, so I don't control for past test scores. And then what you can see in the panel B here is that what happens when I control for achievement in kindergarten, right? And achievement in kindergarten is, of course, highly predictive of all these outcomes. What you see is that the coefficients are somewhat reduced, but not so much. Now, what you can do is this nice method by Altonji and co-authors, and that's redeveloped by, or was further developed by Emily Oster in her 2019, I guess, paper, to see, okay, to what extent, or to judge how important is omitted variable bias in these estimates, right? What I see if I do this kind of analysis is that, okay, I control for achievement in kindergarten, the coefficient goes down a little bit, but the R square goes up a lot because these achievement in kindergarten measures are really highly predictive of all the outcomes. And you can calculate how much more selection on unobservables would they have to be to sort of drive my coefficients to 0 to make all of this go to 0 because we have omitted variable bias. And what you find is that the selection on unobservables would have to be around 8 to 10 times, I think, higher compared to the selection on observed achievement in kindergarten, right? So if you look at Emily Oster's paper, she will tell you anything above 1 is kind of unrealistic. So here we have a factor of 8. So it gives at least a strong suggestive indication that what we see here is really due to motivation and not due to other correlated unobserved factors. But I don't want to say, I don't want to push it too far. I'm not going to say this is a causal effect. So for causal effects, we can look at the second part, and which is potentially the more interesting part on peer effects, right? So whenever you measure peer effects, as I think Bernardo knows very well, he also works on that, they face the very tough empirical challenge that in real life, nobody chooses their peers randomly. Indeed, we can, for example, imagine a situation where parents of high achieving kids place them in a class with very academically motivated other children. In this case, what we're going to see in the data is a correlation between peers' motivation and achievement, but this could be purely due to this selection mechanisms where parents place their kids strategically in classes, right? So this wouldn't be a causal effect. And the only way to break this really is to have some natural experiment or some randomized experiments where peers are randomly assigned. And luckily, the Project STAR setting here allows me to observe just such a situation. So students who entered the experiment were randomly assigned to classes, which created random variation in the composition of their classmates, and the classmates are going to be the peer group of interest here. Now, what I do in this analysis is to focus on a subset of students, namely those who entered the project for the first time in second or third grade, because the reason is that their parents moved into the catchment area of the participating schools after grade 1 or after grade 2, right, or at some point in between. So they first enter the experiment in second or third grade, then they get randomly assigned to classes. Now, what's good about these students for me is that because motivation was measured in every year from first grade onwards, right? Say I take a student who enters in second grade, gets assigned to a class, then I know all of the classmates' motivation measures from the previous year, okay? So I can observe classmates' predetermined motivation at the end of the previous school year. And that's really important because motivation is nothing that's fixed, right? We have a lot of evidence that these kind of non-cognitive skills change over time, especially in young kids. So if I chose any kind of motivation measure that was measured after the kids are already interacting, right, this would be probably tainted. So I really want this predetermined measure, which is why I focus on this subsample of second and third grade entrance. And it's still around 3,000 kids, right? So still reasonably large sample. So what I estimate then is just a linear means model of peer effects. So this is the most widely estimated model of peer effects. It essentially just says, how should we model motivation of our peers? And the answer is, okay, let's take the average as a good first shot. And I will show you some evidence where I deviate sort of from this linear means model later on. So what I do is I relate outcome Y of student I now in class C and school S, or school by entry grade S, to the average motivation of their peers as measured in the previous school year. A bunch of controls at the individual level. I have some controls at the peer level. I will talk about that later. Randomization block fixed effects. And because I don't want this small class treatment, which was the original purpose of the experiment, to bias my results, I always control for the original treatment. But as I said, I can just kick out the small classes as well, and all the results hold.
Jan, sorry, just quick clarification question.
Sure.
This is like the average of motivation is like the leave me out means, or like you exclude like students I motivation in this?
Exactly. So
okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's everybody else who was in the experiment already in the previous year, their motivation. I'm the one, student I is entering, and I don't include that.
Thanks.
All right, so this is going to identify the causal effect of exposure to motivated peers as long as assignment to classes and classmates is truly random. Now, I'm in a fortunate situation here. There's been a lot of previous analyses of Project STAR, and they all have done great work on, like really establishing that things are random. But just to give you some short evidence here, and there's a lot more in the paper. One balancing test, or maybe the most obvious one, is that if assignment is truly random, then the motivation of my peers shouldn't be related to my background characteristics, right? That cannot be changed. And that's exactly what I show here. So I run the regression that I just showed you, but as outcomes, I take indicators for being male, for being Black, and for being eligible for free lunch, so a poverty indicator. And here on the right-hand scale, I also have age as an outcome, all of which are predetermined, all of which shouldn't change or shouldn't be correlated with the motivation of my classmates if assignment is random. And what we see is indeed like effects, coefficients that are close to 0 and never statistically significant, right? And We can do much more in terms of randomization checks, but I'm not going to go over that yet. All of it points to it being random. Okay, so final slide before we go to the results. Now, if you believe me that this is really random, we're going to identify the causal effect of exposure to these motivated peers. But then the question is it really that these peers are more motivated, or is it, you know, some correlated peer characteristics? And I'm going to address this by showing you, first of all, some naked estimates where I don't control for anything else in terms of the peer characteristics. And then I'm going to add one by one controls for peers past achievement, and then peers socio-demographic composition. So the share of female peers, their average age, share of free lunch peers, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and the main outcome of interest now in this next analysis is just going to be the test scores at the end of your first year, right? So you enter, for example, in the beginning of second year, you're randomly assigned to a class within a school. I'm going to measure your test scores at the end of the second year, right? So after 10 months or so of interacting with these peers. And then later on, I will also look at longer term outcomes. So here's the main result for this part. These are the naked estimates, right? And what we see here is that being randomly assigned to a class where peers have on average a 1 standard deviation higher motivation increases my test scores in reading by around 8% of a standard deviation and in math by around 4%, but this effect is not statistically significant. Okay, so the question is, what happens when I throw in these peer controls? So here I control for achievement and not much happens, right? Coefficient is reduced a little bit. And here I can additionally control for like gender composition and all these kind of things. And you can see again, coefficient is reduced a little bit, but not much compared to what we saw before, right? So this really suggests that, I mean, this is really what we're seeing as a spillover due to peers motivation and not due to other correlated characteristics. Now I can do this kind of Oster analysis again, where I say, okay, now I throw in these controls, the coefficient changes a little bit, the R squared goes up, right? If I take this method, it will tell me how much selection on unobservables would I need to see to drive this coefficient to 0, to mean that all of this is due to some omitted variable bias. And the number here is going to be 2, right? Again, anything above 1 is considered to be robust. Here we have the factor of 2. So again, also this points in the direction of this being a personality spillover due to peers motivation rather than something else. I also want to point out, like, or I also want to compare, like, is this a large effect or not? So in the same regression, right, as soon as I throw in the achievement controls, I also automatically measure the more traditional achievement peer effects, right? There's a large literature that says, what happens if I assign you to a class with high achieving peers? And I do find these achievement effects here as well. Being together in a class where peers have 1 standard deviation higher test scores in the past boosts their own test scores by 15% of standard deviation. Okay, so this 8% effect here that we see here is around half the size of the achievement peer effect. I also find gender peer effects, but I don't remember the size of those. Okay, so it's I mean, in terms of the peer effects literature, it's a pretty sizable effect. Now I have maybe, I guess, 5 to 10 minutes or so.
So sure, yeah.
Yeah, and so the next thing I want to talk about is like this question which has been out there both in economics and psychology, is like, what factors shape our personality, right? So where do these non-cognitive skills, these personalities actually, factors or aspects actually come from? And the evidence we have so far says, okay, there's a lot of transmission from parents. Then we know that these interventions in schools work, right? We have these programs in schools to foster grit and to foster patience, and these really work well. And the question is here for me, do peers also matter? I was curious about this, and there's no causal evidence on this. And so this is the first causal evidence on spillovers on own motivation. Again, the regression here is the same. Now the outcome is your own motivation at the end of the first year. So again, if you think about a second year student, a student entering at the beginning of second year, I measure your motivation after 1 year of interacting with these highly motivated peers, right? And what we see is the 0 coefficient, okay? Whether I'm in a class with highly motivated peers or low motivated peers, it's not changing my own motivation. Then I do have this second measure, which is also related to personality. It's not one of the core concepts of personality, but it's in typical models of personality, which is self-concept. So this is essentially how you think about your own academic abilities, right? Whether you feel good, whether you feel like you're a high achiever or not. And I just threw this in as well to see is something happening there. You know, if you're around with a lot of motivated peers, if you're thrown in with a bunch of those, maybe it makes you feel bad, or it actually boosts your self-confidence, or who knows what. No, nothing of that sort is going on here either, right? So, I mean, the estimates are not super precise, but the point estimates are essentially precise 0, okay? So no spillovers on motivation. And then the final thing is I want to show you is about long-term effects. So the question is, I mean, what I've shown you now is, okay, you together in class with these more motivated peers, and it boosts your reading scores, your math scores, maybe a little bit, but it's not statistically significant. Now, this is just the first year effect when you really interact with these peers, right? What happened is that after 3rd grade, this experiment ended and everything went back to normal. Classes were reorganized, etc., etc. So anything that comes afterwards is going to be, or the treatment here is going to be exposure to these more motivated peers for around 1 or 2 years during the experiment, right? So if you're randomly assigned to a class with more motivated peers in the experiment, it definitely doesn't mean that you're with more motivated peers later on. So it's really a short-term exposure effect. So what happens here in terms of long-term outcomes? The first 2 estimates are just the ones we've seen before again. So we have this boost in first-year reading scores, somewhat in first-year math scores. And then as soon as I move beyond this, grade 5 to 8, right? This is when the peers, this motivated peers have left. Now you're back in a normal class. And what we see is actually a negative point estimate, however, not statistically significant at conventional levels. I can also sort of split this up into year-by-year effects. I haven't done this now, but what you see is a pretty quick fade out. As soon as they leave this experiment and classes are reorganized, you know, after 1 year, you're already back to very small effects. And afterwards, most point estimates are actually negative, but none is ever statistically significant. And also, when we look at very long-term outcomes, you know, it doesn't seem to matter in terms of like going to college or graduating from high school. And also here, point estimates are negative, which is a bit surprising. So what do we make of this? What's the mechanism here? I mean, the first thing is about, if we think about the contemporaneous effects, so in the same year that you're together with the peers, what's happening there? What we saw in the first part is that motivated students are really behaving much, much better in the classroom in terms of the effort, in terms of discipline, as rated by their teachers, right? So a natural explanation here is that these motivated, if you're thrown together with a bunch of motivated peers, you're essentially also being thrown together with peers that are much better behaved in the classroom. And this might explain the raised achievement. Then in terms of long-term effects or the absence of those, the previous literature, if you look at some of the papers by Jim Heckman on preschool, on the peri-preschool program, for example, they will tell you that childhood interventions often boost long-term outcomes by affecting personality or non-cognitive skills, right? So these are particularly effective if non-cognitive skills are boosted. Here, what we see is that own motivation, so own personality, at least as measured by motivation, is unaffected, right? And then what this means is that, or one explanation is here, that the short-term gains in reading that we see of like 8% of standard deviation was the kind of magnitude. Those by themselves are too small to generate long-term effects, right? If I don't change the personality also of my peers. So that's my take on this. Then should I wrap up now, or should I talk for 1 more minute about heterogeneity?
Well, yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So this is my second from last slide. So just in terms of heterogeneity and robustness, I do a lot more analysis. We can see that if peer effect is roughly linear in classmates' average motivation, maybe not so interesting. I look and split the sample in many different ways. The effect is somewhat larger for boys and in regular sized classes, but never statistically different, you know, for boys and girls, and in large versus or regular size versus small classes. And maybe what I want to show here is that it's driven by the absence of peers with very low motivation. So here I didn't bring a graph, I have a regression table. So I'm deviating from this linear and means model here, and I'm not going to any longer like measure peer motivation using just the average, but rather using the share of peers with very high motivation, so top 33% according to this test, and the share of peers with very low motivation. And I define this here as bottom 33% of that test. I mean, you can also do the cutoff at 25% or so. It gives you something similar, okay? So if we look at reading scores, let's focus on this just for the sake of shortness. And we can also look right away at panel B, where I control for all kinds of peer characteristics. What we see is that, okay, having a higher share of peers with very high motivation seems to have a positive effect, but it's not statistically significant. But what really matters is that if you have some of these like really bad apples, like really unmotivated peers, according to this test, it goes really badly for you, right? Pretty high effect here. If you have, say, a 10% higher share of peers with these bottom 33% of motivation, so that's 2 additional students with like really low motivation, you already see a 4% drop of a standard deviation drop in your test scores, right? So what matters are these really, really bad, like very low motivated peers, okay? So these are driving the effect. Then I have a bunch of robustness checks. There's no selective attrition driving the results. We can, as I said, restrict the whole sample to regular sized classes, take out this small class sizes kind of treatment altogether, and that also works. And I think what's perhaps most important here is that, I mean, across at least what I've shown you today, we've seen only one statistically significant effect, which is on these like same grade reading scores, right? It could just be like by chance due to multiple hypothesis testing. I also showed you results for many other things, but what I find is that when I do adjustments for multiple hypothesis testing, this effect still persists, okay? So let me wrap up. What I show here is that motivation matters for educational success, first at the individual level. So motivation in early elementary school positively predicts all kinds of measures of educational success, all the way to taking a college entrance exam, and even when I control for achievement as a proxy for cognitive ability. And then the second part, which is really causal effects, shows that exposure to motivated peers raises contemporaneous achievement, at least on this reading test. And this effect is distinct or operates over and above spillovers due to peers' ability and their socio-demographic composition. So what we see here really is a spillover from personality rather than some other correlated characteristic. Now, how does that matter for policy? Well, this goes back to the very first slide. I told you that there are all these interventions to boost grit and patience in children. And what we see here and what my results suggest is that these interventions could actually have much larger positive effects than we thought, because I show being around motivated kids raises test scores. So it might also be the case that being around gritty kids or more patient kids also raises test scores. So the benefits of these kind of interventions are larger than we think. Actually, in psychology, there are also some studies now on interventions to boost motivations. In short, this works by helping students set goals. So some interventions explicitly ask students to set goals, and this actually boosts motivation in a certain sense. Or you can instruct teachers to relate materials to students' daily lives. Seems pretty simple, but it's really an effective motivation. If teachers are just reminded of this, you know, rather than showing an abstract math problem, why don't you make it about students' lives? Then students on these kind of motivation tests are scoring much higher. They're much more motivated to learn these things. So these kind of interventions have then potentially larger effects, not only for the students themselves, but also for their peers. And that's all I want to say. So thanks a lot for listening. And now I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks so much, Jan. That was quite informative. The floor is open to questions and comments. Bernardo, I'm sure you have a lot to ask.
Yes.
So don't be shy. Please go ahead.
Okay, I will start with just a couple of questions, and then I will wait for the floor to.
Sure.
So my first question is like, do you have any story behind on why do you find the effects like only for reading and not for math?
No, I have no story on that. As you probably know, I mean, often what we see in interventions that you find larger effects on math than on reading. And here is the opposite. Mm-hmm. What I can tell you though is like, I mean, I'm showing math and reading also partly because I don't want to make the paper and the presentation too long. I actually have several more dimensions. And there's one dimension which is called word study or vocabulary skills, which is closely related to reading. I also find very positive peer effects there. And then I have some other tests that are more in the math direction, and I find nothing there. So this is consistent across even further dimensions of this test that on reading and vocabulary skills, anything that's sort of related to verbal skills, we find positive effects, not so much on math.
Okay, thanks. And my second question, so well, at the end you talk about some dimensions of heterogeneity.
Yeah.
Do you look at, so like you show like that having, let's say, 2 bad apples in the class that you're thrown into, it has a bad effect on you.
Yeah.
What about like heterogeneity from the point of students who are entering? Like, does it matter? Let's say, I don't know, I'm thinking like, if I'm a highly motivated student, maybe I will be happy to be around with other highly motivated students, but if I'm a lowly motivated student, maybe I don't care and I will just stay lowly motivated. Like, do you look at this dimension of heterogeneity?
That's a great question. I would love to look at this, but the thing is with these students who enter later on, for them, we don't have any baseline, we have only very few baseline measurements. And we don't know, they come from other schools, right? They were outside of the experiment before, so their motivation wasn't measured at baseline. So I can't do this kind of split. I mean, I would love to do that, but unfortunately I can't.
Okay, well, oh, sorry, Bernardo.
Sorry, yeah, one just a follow-up question, and I will leave the floor to the rest.
Okay, there is a small lineup of people.
Yeah, I know.
I want to ask, all right.
Yeah, so do you know, like, I don't know, like, do you have any information of like those incoming students of why do they move to these schools? Any idea or no?
No idea, unfortunately. There's no data collected on their parents at that point.
Okay. Well, thanks. I will leave the floor to.
All right, thanks. Maria has a question. Maria, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan, for exciting presentation. So really interesting. I have a few comments and questions. And my first question is, did you try to check for teacher effect? I'm asking that because it's probably the case that if there is a motivated group of students, the school administration would assign a especially good teacher to this class. And if teacher is good, then there might be a kind of teacher effect here. That would be great to see whether it's possible to control for that somehow.
That's also a great question. So I didn't emphasize this so much, but what's nice in this experiment is that teachers were also randomly assigned. So you have in this particular setting, you have grade specific teachers, right? So one teacher would always teach only grade 1, one teacher would always teach 2, or there were several teachers, right? So every year in the experiment, teachers were randomly assigned again when the cohort moved on. And so there's no systematic way in which teachers are assigned to more motivated classes or something like this. But what that also means is that I can test for some kind of, you could say, complementarities, right, between teacher skills and peer effects. And I think this is really like a promising avenue of research. There's a couple of papers doing this now, not with personality peer effects, but with other kind of peer effects. And what I find is that if you're in, for example, in class with more motivated peers and the teacher is more experienced, then I think the peer effect is a little bit higher, if I remember correctly. The problem is that, as soon as you come into these interaction effects, your statistical power or the requirements for statistical power are high, and then the sample becomes too small. So I can't ever find any statistically significant differences between, for example, experienced or inexperienced teachers.
Thanks a lot. Then my next question would be about potential control for gender composition. Do you know the gender composition of classes? I'm asking that because, again, if I'm a girl, I'm probably being more motivated by girls' motivation, not by boys, because sometimes at this age, there's kind of not struggle, but kind of opposition between different genders. And also for young children, it's quite often that for the first grades, boys are smart, but not too much disciplined, but girls are more disciplined. That's why girls have a little bit different motivation here. And if it's possible to control for that, it might clarify a little bit.
Okay, I'm trying to look up these results, but I mean, I did this analysis actually. So I do control for gender composition, and I look exactly at what you were asking at, which sometimes is called homophily effects, right? Do girls are maybe more likely to hang out with girls, and that it matters more that the girls in the class are motivated and boys with boys. And again, I find that this is actually, I mean, effects go in this direction. In particular, for males, the effect of having highly motivated male peers is larger than having highly motivated female peers. Okay, so males with males, females with females, these are the combinations that matter most. But in terms of statistical power, this difference is not significant at conventional levels again. But at least it's suggestive of exactly what you were saying, right? These kind of homophily effects.
Great. And thanks a lot. And my last comment would be just about like simple hypothesis why reading is associated with more effects. That's probably because at this age, reading exercises are much more visible. So that's mostly reading something aloud, and everybody can see that the person like A or B does it well. And if you do math exercises, you do it mostly on your notebook, and you just know other people's grades, and it's not that motivational for people. That might be the case.
That's fantastic. I'm actually going to write this down. I think this is a great potential explanation. Thanks.
Yeah, that's all from my side. Thanks.
May I ask a question?
Tatiana, please. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry,
thank you for your presentation. I also study motivation, but I have quite of disappointed studying it because we have quite big samples of elementary school students, and we never found out where so close relationships between motivation and objective measures of academic achievement with math or reading. Never. So it's very small motivation. It's even sometimes it's not significant at all. It's correlation level. It's quite surprising because all educational and psychological literature tell us what there should be a relationship, and this is why I think what in your study, the teacher effect is could be a very important, and not only what there are more qualified teachers there, but just teachers who know where students are more motivated and who perceive their students would behave better. They could change their strategies and attitudes toward students, and it could be very important. But I also have a question about this motivation score. Is it quite old instrument? I understand what it's not based on modern motivation theories.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So I think that's one drawback. I mean, nowadays you have, as you will probably know, like self-determination theory and these kind of things. And that theory was developed after this measurement was developed, right? So it doesn't fit one-to-one with these things. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, but it's quite similar. What it's asking about interest in learning in different areas.
Yeah, exactly. So it measures, I mean, if you're a little bit familiar with this literature, it measures achievement needs and a failure avoidance. So on the one hand, being interested in being a high achiever. On the other hand, not like sort of not failing to learn something and like making a bad impression.
It's quite interesting because maybe it explains with different relations with reading and math, because there are different strategies what we could use, because math usually is especially for girls, and especially in that times 20 years ago, it could be what is rising with differences, and as well it's quite interesting how teachers could use this information about achieving goals or avoiding. So it's quite interesting to think how we can use it in practice.
Yeah, no, I agree. Maybe I should also study a little bit more, like try to push more this idea of, how teachers matter in this context, both in terms of peer effects or by themselves in boosting motivation and stuff. But
one more. Do you have a big variation in motivation scores? The variation is big, or still students are tended to answer more positively?
It's actually pretty big. I didn't believe it either. I thought like everybody would just be happy all the time when they say, "Oh, how do you think about yourself reading like a grown up?" And everybody would like score super highly. But it's actually not the case. No, it's quite a lot of kind of like I don't care, or like I'm pretty like sad face, or like neutral face. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Anyone else, please? Any further questions? Any comments to Jan's paper? Jan, I have a question. In fact, I would like to follow on what Maria said.
Yeah.
She said that peer effect for a girl could be stronger if the influence comes from girls than otherwise. So I would like to talk about race, your control for students being Black.
I do, yeah.
By the way, do you have any controls for Hispanic students as well? Were there too many of them? Or
there are literally, I think, 2 among the 9,000 or so.
Okay, so there are a few. Okay.
Like very few.
Yeah, right. Not surprising. Reason I'm asking, there is some literature on image concern and peer pressure. And I'm not sure if you know these papers, and some of those deal with education, with peer pressure and education. It's Burstein and Jensen and Yegorov. They did some work there. And what they study is this effect of acting white. I'm not sure if you heard about that.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Sometimes Black kids feel reluctant to excel academically because that would reduce their esteem in the eyes of their Black peers. And if you work hard, if you apply efforts, if you achieve high results and get good grades, you're acting white, and that carries some stigma. So I'm wondering if we can find something like that sort in your study. And I'm not sure how we can do this, but one thing that comes to my mind is in your regressions, you control for race, as far as I know, right?
Yeah.
You can also control for the prevalence of this race in the class.
Exactly.
And in the environment, and then maybe want to take interaction of these two. In other words, the peer influence of Black students around you on you. Being a Black student will depend on how many Black students are there, because you're concerned about the stigma of acting white would not be as strong if you're surrounded by white kids. But if a majority of students are Black, then this effect might be more visible and might get a more nuanced and fine-grained picture.
No, thanks. No, I can definitely do that. I mean, I do control for you individually being Black and the share of Black peers in the class, but I haven't looked at the interaction yet. I mean, I did that with, I mean, what Maria asked for, what was like gender. That's what I did exactly.
Yeah,
but I think it makes sense to do that also for race, and especially with this acting white hypothesis. Yeah.
And if you want, I can send you some if you saw these papers by Burstein and others on peer effect and motivation, image concern, that's fine. If not, I can easily send it to you.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, perfect. Will do. Okay, excellent. Please.
Maria has one comment.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I didn't see it, Masha. I'm sorry.
If I may, that just, I do understand that you can't do it with your current data, but just kind of idea for potential further research. We look on the students' peer effects and also on teacher peer effects, but you might also look on parents' peer effects, because now computer technologies allow like parents come together in chat groups and something like that. So if parents are trying to motivate children, so they kind of group together. So parents of motivated children, they also make some cliques all together, which might also partially explain your results, why it doesn't last long, because when children go to other schools and other environment, parents don't communicate anymore, and this channel doesn't work at all. So at least in Russian context, now parents communicate within the class groups and subgroups very actively, and they coordinate, they influence each other, they suggest different techniques, and that's also influence students' achievements. Just an idea for.
I think that idea makes a lot of sense. I think with this current data, I have extremely little or close to nothing on the parents, so unfortunately I can't do it, but that's a great idea for like the next paper, hopefully.
Excellent. Let me see if there are if there are any further questions and comments, and I do not see any. And what is left? to be done is to ask Bernardo what's coming up next before we thank Jan. Bernardo, can you make an announcement, please?
Yeah, first, thanks, Jan, for your presentation. I think you're all pretty interesting in your research.
Thanks.
And so next week we have a break, and then we will have many weeks with speakers. So on the 25th of February, so in 2 weeks' time, Alexander Yarkin, alumni from HSC, he will be presenting his paper on ancestral shocks and political attitudes of immigrants, evidence from the European refugee crisis. So that will be in 2 weeks' time.
Very good. And yeah, and of course, you're welcome to join our seminars if you found it interesting. This time, not as a speaker, but as an attendee, it's open. Thank you so much, sir, for your great presentation, for the interesting discussion that it stimulated. And we would very much like to stay in touch and perhaps have you back sometime in the future. And
thanks a lot. Great comments, you know, and a lot of comments that I hadn't heard before on like ideas. So it was really fantastic to get this input.
Okay, very good. This is what seminars are all for, to be mutually enriching.